Whoa, is this for real? Is this what it really looks like? Huh, that's interesting. Hello wonderful person. Let's continue our adventure in Flight Simulator and discover some of the other extremely unusual craters on our planet. And we're going to start right here. When I first discovered this, my mind was instantly blown. So okay, realistically, this is not exactly what this crater looks like, but it's very close to the reality. This is one of the coolest, one of the most unusual, and also one of the most pristine crater locations on our planet. And turns out that this is also located in my home country of Canada, in the same province where I grew up, in Quebec. Currently this crater is known as Pingaluit, but this name has been changed in the past, so it might change again. And honestly, this looks absolutely incredible. So first of all, there's a lake inside. Second of all, the crater itself and the lake itself is sort of lifted compared to the ground around it. Although not to the extremes you see here. This crater doesn't actually have a ravine like this, but as you can see on the left side, the ground is lifted. But this glitch does create a very peculiar and extremely unusual lake and of course meteorite crater. Now the lake itself is also very deep, it's about 270 meters deep, making this one of the deepest lakes in North America. And apparently the water here is one of the cleanest, most transparent, and also least saline or least salty waters on the planet, if not the most. I think the actual record for the least salty water is from this lake. Interestingly, there's only one type of fish here. It's just a type of Arctic char that's managed to adapt to live in this lake. But because this lake is so extremely clean and so transparent, there is really not that much nutrient for any other life to survive. With the diameter of about 3.5 kilometers, which you can see here is actually pretty big, and also with the age of about 1.4 million years, what makes this region especially unusual is of course the fact that this crater is actually lifted compared to the ground around it. It becomes a little bit more apparent if you look at the actual photos of the crater, but even if we use an airplane that flies higher, you can sort of start seeing the elevation of the crater compared to the land around it. So this is a really cool location that I think most people in Flight Simulator don't really know about, and I think most people in Canada have never heard of this crater either. I mean, I personally haven't, and I grew up here. So in that sense, this is a pretty exciting location. Interestingly, from what I've read about it, all of the water here accumulated over centuries and technically over thousands and millions of years from just rain and snow. Melting, evaporating, melting, evaporating. There is nothing flowing into or out of this crater, so all of this water is completely pristine and technically around 1.4 million years old. The locals here, the Inuit who live nearby, refer to this as the Crystal Eye of Nunavik. And because it's so perfectly circular and so easily visible from the air, back in World War II it was used as a navigation beacon by various World War II pilots. The last expedition to this location was back in 2007, and the scientists discovered that it contains a huge amount of deposit from, well, once again, about 1 million years in the past, and most of this was various types of algae and insects deposited in the upper 8.5 meters of sediment on the bottom. So this is an extremely important location for scientists, and it also contains some of the most unusual water with some of the strangest chemical composition compared to anything else we have on the planet. And so when I just saw this crater for the first time in the simulator, I actually couldn't believe it was real, but turns out it absolutely is, and it looks, well, even better than this in real life apparently. But chances are most of us will never get to visit this because of the remoteness of the location and because it's still in a national park that's difficult to reach, unless you can somehow rent a small airplane and fly there just like we do right here in Flight Simulator. For now, this is probably going to be the only time most of us will visit this incredible location. But speaking of amazing craters in Canada, the most famous crater is unfortunately kind of difficult to represent here in the game, but I'm gonna try. It's the one that sometimes is referred to as the Eye of Quebec, more officially known as the Manikugan crater or Manikugan Reservoir, and here, well, you can already see the outline, but it's going to be really difficult to see from an airplane. Actually, let's take something larger, or something capable of flying a little bit higher. Let's take a jet plane. This is one of the biggest craters on the planet, and it's sort of well known because of one specific feature. It has an island in the middle, and the island has a lake, and that lake also has an island. So it's sort of like an islandception or lakeception. But for the most part, this is all we're going to see here. It's very difficult to see the actual outline of the crater, and we're not going to be able to see much more. I'm gonna see if I can fly much higher, and I think from the higher altitude we'll at least be able to tell the outline of the water there that you can sort of already see, and from the higher altitude you can already start seeing the outline of the water at least, and that's of course one of the layers created by the impact. Now these impacts were much larger than some of the ones we've discussed previously, and these were usually rocks that are a few kilometers in size. Now, these craters are obviously very difficult to see from the outside unless you actually study the geology of various deposits underneath. But in case of the Eye of Quebec, in case of Manikugan, the telltale sign here is the circular shape that the water creates. So this waterway, the outline of the water you see right there in the back, that's essentially the telltale sign and the reason we know today that this is definitely an ancient impact. And this is from about 214 million years ago, and it still is there, and it's still quite visible from space as well. Now this was probably an object that was about 5 kilometers in diameter, and the resulting shape was roughly around 70 to 100 kilometers in diameter. So the size of this island is not small at all. What you're looking at here is roughly around 70 kilometers in diameter. Now, other than that, it's actually not that exciting. There's really nothing else we get to see here, especially because it's a much older crater than the ones we're going to be looking at now. And for this, we're going to take this very famous bush airplane and return to Australia. This is the Gozes Bluff crater. Now, what you're looking at here is actually only the central region of the crater that was created by a very powerful collision that resulted in all of this rock sort of uplifting in this way. It's a little bit easier to see this from space, from the International Space Station, but because we can't really go that high, we're gonna have to try to use our imagination. Now this is about 175 kilometers west of Alice Springs, the closest city here, and this is essentially in pretty much the center of Australia itself, not so far from the famous Uluru Rock. But because this is such a large formation, and this is only the central part of this formation, the approximate age for this is about 140 million years. So this is pretty much just as old as the last crater I showed you. This is so old, as a matter of fact, that the original rim that this crater probably had has long been eroded, and the estimates for the original size are at around 22 kilometers. So only this central region here indicates that this was a pretty powerful collision, and most likely was with another rock that was about 5 kilometers in diameter. And this actually did create this region here that's about 5 kilometers as well, and this goes up to about 180 meters, with the central uplift here being a telltale sign of an extremely powerful event. But as you can see, the rest of this area is pretty much flat, and it's the typical Australian outback with very dry conditions and also relatively deadly wildlife. But honestly, I found this to be a pretty cool location simply because of how unusual it looks, and of course what all of this represents. The event that was so powerful that it uplifted all of this by around 180 meters in height. Now we see similar uplifting features on other objects, like for example the moon, and of course on objects like Mercury, but for Earth this is extremely rare. We might be able to find some in the future, but because our planet is so good at destroying and eroding this, it's actually one of the rarest objects on the planet. But I guess enough about the Gozes Bluff, and let's go to the next location. This beautiful location located in South Africa known as the Tswai-in crater. I'm probably not pronouncing this right, but what you gonna do? Anyway, so this location is actually extremely interesting for historical reasons. The crater itself is not very big. It was most likely produced by something around 50 meters or even less than that, maybe 30 to 50 meters in size, and it's also much younger. Approximately 120,000 years old. The total diameter here is only a little bit bigger than 1 kilometer, and the total depth is a little bit larger than 100 meters. So overall this is a relatively small crater. But what's interesting here is actually related to its name. The name itself means place of salt. And it has this name in many different languages, including Afrikaans, where it's known as the Zoutpankkrater. I totally mispronounced that again. But anyway, so for about 100,000 years, this was actually used by various peoples that used to live here to collect salt. And as you can imagine, most of the salt probably came from outer space. Specifically, the types of salts we're talking about here are the carbonates and various sodium chlorides, and all of this is known to be present in various asteroids and various comets. So this location, surprisingly, was used by humanity for over 100,000 years to collect the same mineral we're still collecting there today as well. and various types of Stone Age tools were discovered in this location, suggesting that this extraction has been going on continuously for a very long time, which also means that unless I'm mistaken and there's another place like this on Earth, it sort of looks like this has been a continuous mine or continuous location for mining salt for the longest time ever. And that makes this a pretty cool place. Alright, next on the list is this incredible creation that's also in Africa, but this time in a different country in Africa, specifically in Mauritania in the Sahara Desert. According to my father, I actually apparently saw this while we were flying over Africa when I was like really young, but because I don't remember, I decided to do this again, this time in a simulation, and honestly this looks absolutely ridiculously amazing. There are surprisingly not a lot of good pictures of this crater. And that's very unfortunate because it seems to be a very beautiful location. The name for this is Tenumer crater, or Tenume? I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce this once again, because I'm here for the science and the discovery, not so much for the pronunciation. Anywho, so that's sort of what it looks like in Flight Simulator, and flying along the rim of this crater you really start appreciating its size. This is a pretty cool place if you ever get to visit it. Now, chances are most of us once again will never get here because of the remoteness of this location, but this is, for me personally, already pretty good. I'm pretty excited to be able to visit this in Flight Simulator. But of all the craters I've visited so far and am going to visit in the future videos and also the ones you're going to see in this video, this is the youngest. It's only about 21,000 years old. That's actually pretty young for craters. It's also almost 2 kilometers in diameter, suggesting that something relatively large did produce it. It also most likely produced an explosion equivalent to one of the biggest atomic bombs ever produced, with a power of roughly around 50 megaton of explosion. And what makes this really interesting is, well, really the deposits here. For the past 20,000 years, it's been collecting a huge amount of deposits, and all of this can be found on the bottom of the crater. This deposit is about 200 to maybe even 300 meters deep. And this also means that if we were to dig deep into the crater, we might discover something really cool and something really unusual. Now, it hasn't been done yet, but well, hopefully will be done in the future. So this is a pretty cool location. It's definitely one of the most scenic and one of the most incredible craters on the planet. But this also means that because it's so young, since it's only about 20,000 years old, there might have been human witnesses here. We don't really know what culture used to reside in this region, and we also obviously have currently no signs and no written or oral traditions explaining what happened here. But at the same time, the research in this area is not particularly thorough. So maybe if we look harder, we might be able to discover certain cultures that used to live here that also experienced this firsthand. Although for now, it's just a pretty cool location to visit in Flight Simulator and in real life. Now, by the way, if you don't have Flight Simulator and if you don't really want to get it, or if your computer can't run this, you can also find all of these craters I've been mentioning in these videos by using Google Earth. They don't really look as impressive and as beautiful as they do in Flight Simulator, but it's still pretty good. And also, before we finish this video, I wanted to go back to this beautiful illustration made by the European Space Agency, underlining one important difference between these craters we've been looking at. So far, we've taken a look at craters that fit right here in between these two, which usually occur on our planet every few hundred or possibly every few thousand years. These explosions normally produce craters that are roughly around 1 or 2 kilometers in size, but are made by relatively small rocks that are around 50 to maybe 100 meters in size. The best example of this is the famous Tunguska event, which didn't produce a crater, but it did produce a really large explosion. The largest of these craters, however, are very rare. These large rocks that are over 1 kilometer in size, which is somewhat similar to the famous asteroid Apophis that's going to come relatively close to the planet in the next decade, only happen on the planet every few million years. So these extremely large destructive rocks we don't really have to worry about. As a matter of fact, we've discovered the vast majority of them with only a few still missing and a few not being found. These smaller rocks that we actually didn't find as many of, and that happen every few hundred and possibly every few thousand years, can still actually land on our planet and cause a destructive event, creating something similar to, for example, famous Behringer crater, also known as the meteor crater from the last video. So in that sense, these events are somewhat interesting. They could be potentially dangerous, but because of the advances in our detection of asteroids, we currently are pretty secure in our ability to detect and also possibly even prevent these collisions from destroying something major around the planet. Nevertheless, our hunt for these objects is definitely going to continue, and most importantly, we're still going to try to find better ways of trying to avoid these collisions from destroying something major on the planet. However, seeing something like this occur in our lifetimes is currently extremely unlikely. These events are still pretty rare. Well, on that note, that's kind of it for now, because I'm going to come back to this in the next video and look at a few more asteroid collisions and a few more meteorite craters that are kind of cool. Specifically, this one right here. Let's talk about this in the next video, and for now, I'll see you tomorrow. Subscribe, share this video with someone who loves learning about space and sciences, and maybe potentially support this channel on Patreon or by buying the wonderful Prism t-shirt you can find in the description below. Also, as I mentioned in the previous video, this is totally not sponsored by Microsoft at all. As a matter of fact, I don't really like Microsoft products. I haven't been using them for a very long time, and this here is the first Microsoft product I've used in decades. I've been using Linux for a very long time, and well, this one here kind of blew my mind. They did a good job with this, and so in that sense, do give this a try, especially in these somewhat difficult times when we can't really travel. And this here has been giving me a kind of a peace of mind. Instead of traveling, I get to explore these virtual worlds that look pretty amazing. Now, I keep saying Microsoft. I believe the actual company that created this is the French company known as Asobo Studio. So technically, all the credit should be going to them. They did an amazing job, and well, kudos for making me feel like I'm traveling finally. On that note, I'll see you in the next video. We're going to explore a few more things and a few more craters that you might have not known about, and we're going to learn a little bit more about the science and history of our planet. Space out, and as always, bye bye.